Hey everyone! Today we're digging into the 100 years of resistance that happened before the famous Indian Rebellion of 1857. And let me tell you, this isn't just some extra footnote to the history books. This is a story that basically rewrites the whole beginning of the struggle against colonial rule.
You know, when we think about big uprisings against the British in India, our minds usually jump straight to 1857, right? But what about the century leading up to it? Was it really just a time of quiet acceptance? Or was there something else going on? A landscape of constant fiery rebellion, just hiding in plain sight?
Well, the truth is, it was an entire century of fire. Long before the 1857 mutiny ever kicked off, the groundwork for a massive revolt was being laid, piece by piece, in countless uprisings all across the subcontinent.
So, who was actually doing the fighting? For almost 100 years, while the British East India Company was expanding its grip, it was met with this relentless opposition from two main groups whose entire lives were being turned completely upside down: peasants and tribal communities.
All right, let's start with the peasants. Now, their struggles weren't just random acts of violence. Nope, they were organized, they were direct, and they were a response to the massive economic chaos the new colonial system was causing. So what exactly were they fighting for?
It really all boiled down to the land. I mean, peasants were protesting being kicked off the farms their families had worked for generations. They were facing rent hikes that were just impossible to pay, and they were falling into these debt traps set by moneylenders. Their main demand was simple, but it was also revolutionary. Occupancy rights, basically the right to work their own land.
And you can see a really clear pattern emerge here. In Bengal alone, you had the Narcobaria uprising fighting back against landlord taxes. You had the Pagopanthes, who just refused to pay ridiculously high rent, and the Sanyasi Revolt, which aimed to kick out English intruders. The leaders' names change, the places change, but that core reason? It stays the same: economic exploitation.
And this wasn't just happening in Bengal, not at all. Over in Malabar, the Mopla community rose up 22 separate times between 1836 and 1854. So when the huge 1857 rebellion finally erupted, you better believe these peasants were ready to join in. But the really tragic part? After the revolt was crushed, the British doubled down on their alliance with the landowners, making life for the peasants even more desperate than before.
Okay, now let's turn to the tribal communities. Because if the peasant revolts were like sparks of resistance, then the tribal uprisings, well, they were raging fires. In fact, they're often seen as the most militant of all these early movements.
Yeah, the most frequent, militant, and violent of all movements. That's how they were described. For them, the arrival of the British and their whole system wasn't just an economic problem. It was a full-blown existential threat.
The disruption to their way of life was total. I mean, the tribe's tradition of owning land together as a community, destroyed. They had to deal with this flood of outsiders, moneylenders, and traders who were backed by the colonial government. Their access to the forest was cut off, and new laws started messing with their customs. This wasn't just a revolt. It was a desperate fight to defend their entire world.
And it's interesting, because there was a key difference in these revolts depending on where you were. On the mainland, the tribal uprisings were mostly about losing their land. But up in the northeast, where tribes often had more control over their territory, the fight was often for something bigger: political autonomy or even outright independence.
So, we've seen why they fought, but how did these revolts actually play out? Let's break down the common anatomy of a tribal uprising. What did they all have in common? Turns out, these revolts usually shared four key ingredients. First, they were held together by really strong ethnic solidarity. Second, their anger was laser-focused on the outsiders, the moneylenders and traders they saw as the face of colonial power. Third, they were often led by these incredible, almost messiah-like figures who promised that a new, better world was coming. And finally, the tragic reality: it was always an unequal fight. They were bringing traditional weapons to a battle against the modern military might of the British.
And to really get the scale of this targeted anger, just look at this number: 1,000. During the Coal Mutiny of 1831 alone, rebels killed or burned the property of about 1,000 of these outsiders. This wasn't just random, chaotic violence. No, this was a calculated strike against the very people they held responsible for their suffering.
And this resistance, it was relentless. I mean, look at this timeline. It shows this constant drumbeat of rebellion, starting with the Paharia's revolt way back in 1778, rolling through the Ho, Munda, and Coal mutinies in the 1820s and 30s, and then building up to the massive Santal Rebellion of 1855, where rebels actually declared their own independent state just 2 years before the big one in 1857.
So after all that,
What's the takeaway? I mean, these uprisings were almost always defeated, right? True, but their real impact goes way beyond just winning or losing. They forged a legacy of defiance that would literally shape the entire future of resistance in India. They were suppressed, for sure, but they were never, ever silenced. Every single revolt, no matter how small or how local, added another thread to this century-long story of resistance. It sent a clear message: colonial expansion would not go unchallenged. This was the foundation that later, much larger movements would be built on.
And that brings us to the big question. When you stop seeing 1857 as this sudden, out-of-nowhere explosion, and instead see it as the climax of 100 years of fire, well, how does that change the story for you? It transforms it from a single event into the peak of a long, desperate, and incredibly defiant struggle for land, for dignity, and for freedom.